Rescuing Regan by Catherine West. Chapter 1. Regan gave Artemis his hand to help her up into the shuttle. It made her pause, and she looked up at him with suddenly shining eyes. "Regan," she murmured, "this is how we met." He looked startled, then sheepish. "I remember. Your hand was so tiny in mine. I felt like such a piece of filth, just daring to touch you." Artemis was surprised. "You didn't hurt me, darling. Even under those circumstances, you never hurt me." "Have I ever apologized for what I did? I'm so sorry, Artemis. I'm appalled at what I did to you." His voice was low and rough, and it cut Artemis to the quick. He'd abducted her, but he'd taken her away from a life where her husband abused her and separated her from her daughter and the rest of her family. She gripped his hand tighter and smiled. "Regan, being abducted by you was the best thing to ever happen to me. I'll never be sorry that you abducted me, that you loved me." "I'm a slave, the gladiator, a human. How do I love a goddess? I might as well love the moon." Artemis brought her hand up so she was clasping his big hand in both of hers, then pulled his hand to her chest so he could feel her heartbeat. "Don't fall in love with the moon, Regan. The moon can't love you like I do. The fates have already joined our lives together forever. And tonight we will celebrate our wedding with my whole family. Don't you want to marry me again, Regan?" He wrapped his arms around her in a sudden bear hug, burying his face against her hair. "I don't deserve you, goddess, but I love you with all my heart, and I will love you all my life." Artemis melted into his embrace, giving him her warmth in her complete surrender. "Just love me," she whispered. "That's all I need. Just love me." He pulled away from her just enough so he could raise her face to his and kiss her. Artemis sighed beneath his kiss, feeling the familiar warmth flood her body. No one had ever made her feel like this. The moment he touched her, she was ready to surrender to him. It was overwhelming, even embarrassing, the way he ruled her body so completely. A small body cannoned into Regan's leg. Artemis felt it brush against her, but the little girl had aimed herself at Regan. She always did. Regan broke the kiss and bent down to pick up the little girl who threw her arms around his neck, crying, "I want to cuddle too, Papa." Regan closed his eyes for a moment in a mixture of gratitude and grief. Sarah was Artemis's daughter by her first husband, but Regan loved her like she was his own. But he had a son and daughter with his first wife, too, and to save them from Artemis's first husband, his best friend had taken them with him to another world. While Regan adored Sarah, he would always grieve for his lost children. Artemis blamed herself. It was her ex-husband Avarius, after all, who had threatened Regan's children and forced Achilles to take them. It eased Regan's mind to know that his children were safe, but nothing could replace them in his life. Sarah was still a little awkward around Artemis. She had spent the first 3 years of her life separated from her mother, and she still wasn't comfortable with her yet. It stung a little when Sarah was so ready to let Regan all the way into her heart when she was still wary of her own mother. Still, she let Artemis stroke her arm as Regan held her, and Artemis told herself to be grateful. "Are you looking forward to the party?" Artemis asked the little girl. Sarah nodded, her head resting against Regan's broad shoulder. "I've got a green dress," she said, as if Artemis hadn't replicated the chiton herself, carefully choosing the right shade of green kava silk to look best with Sarah's flaming red curls. "You'll look so pretty in your green dress," Artemis assured her. She reached for the little girl. "Will you sit on my lap while Papa flies the shuttle?" Sarah's little arms sneaked tight around Regan's neck. "Want Papa to hold me." Regan detached her clinging arms and handed her to Artemis. Sarah let herself be passed over, but she went limp and unresisting in Artemis's arms. She hung her bright little head and started to cry, but she didn't rest her head against her mother. Artemis felt tears in her own eyes. She would do anything for this little girl, had put up with abuse and torture for this little girl for years, and now Sarah sobbed just to let Artemis hold her in the shuttle. Regan got them into the shuttle and settled them both safely in the passenger seat. He sat down in the pilot's seat and strapped himself in. "It'll be okay, baby," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion, and Artemis wasn't sure if he was talking to her or Sarah. "It'll be okay, sweetheart." Regan. It was his first time flying to Atlantis. It was imposing and impressive, guarded by 2 large statues of ancient warriors that were said to come to life if the city was ever threatened. It looked nothing like the human cities Regan was used to. He'd never seen the cities of the gods before, although he had spent several weeks living on the spaceship that was known as the House of Zeus. While there were several cities of the gods, Atlantis was the crown of them all. The entire island was elegant and luxurious, showcasing the advanced technology and privileged lifestyles that the gods loved to flaunt in the face of their human slaves. Great spires of crystal stretched towards the sky. Sparkling domes topped sophisticated palaces, and broad streets led to great plazas where the lesser gods scrolled at their ease beneath the shade of ancient trees. They were heading for the greatest palace in the whole of Atlantis. It stood at the top of the hill in the very center of the city. Its walls encircled buildings of latticed white stone and verdant gardens. They were expected. This was yet another house that belonged to Artemis's father, Zeus. The level of wealth and privilege enjoyed by his new mate's family still boggled Regan's mind. He had spent his life in single-room apartments or in a dormitory shared by other gladiators. The only home he had ever really been able to call his own had been a cabin he had built in the woods with his own hands, a single room that he had shared with his 2 young children after his wife died. He had taken Artemis there when he had abducted her, planning to leave her there until he could get a ransom for her from her cruel husband who had taken his children as slaves. It wasn't until he had seen her standing there, so elegant and terrified in her beautiful white silk dress with the golden brooches on the shoulders, that he realized just how primitive the cabin really was. He felt ashamed of himself, or even taking her there. He was apprehensive about the wedding, but not quite sure how to share his concerns with his new mate. They had been matched by the fates, and, as she had said, they were now bonded forever. But this was to be their official wedding celebration with her family. This was the day that he, Regan, a human, dared to take the hand of the goddess Artemis and claim her for his own. It seemed like the most unutterable gall. Any minute now, he was sure that she would realize what a terrible mistake she was making and back out. And he wouldn't blame her one bit. He glanced over at her, holding Sarah in her lap. At least the little girl had stopped crying. She was sitting up in her mother's lap now, looking dully out of the window at the wonders of the greatest city of the gods. She had gone to him from the very beginning. She had been friends with Cassandra, his own daughter, when she was in the House of Women. Cassandra had told the little girl that her papa would become Sarah's papa, and Sarah had trusted her implicitly. They had only spent a few weeks together, but already he loved her like she was his own. He'd always enjoyed being a father, and it was a delight to have the little girl around. He wondered if it was even possible for a human to get a child on a goddess. Given that he and Artemis had spent most of the last 3 weeks in bed, he'd certainly done his best to test the theory. In just a few hours they would be wed, unless Artemis came to her senses first. Artemis. Artemis had been to Atlantis many times before. She didn't even notice the gleaming white walls of her father's palace or the silver spires that rose above the city. All she could think about was the little girl in her lap and how much she ached to clasp her tightly in her arms and whisper sweet words into those tiny little ears. Regan landed the shuttle, and the servants came to show them to their rooms. Eurycleia was already there, ordering the other servants around and making sure that everything was ready in preparation for the arrival of her charge. As soon as Artemis put her down, Sarah toddled towards her old nurse as fast as she could go. Eurycleia swept her up in her arms into a warm hug. The little girl whispered quick, excited words into her old nurse's ears. "Really? Euryclea exclaimed gently. Well, if you're going to be wearing a green dress, then I think you ought to go down for your nap right now. You don't want to have big dark circles under your eyes at the wedding now, do you? She nodded at Artemis and Regan and carried the little girl away. Artemis turned to her mate. Oh, Regan, she cried. I love her so much, but she breaks my heart sometimes. I just don't know how to get through to her. Regan's arms came around her gently and comforted her as she cried. An hour later, Artemis was being escorted away so that she could be prepared for the wedding. She sat quietly and let them do her hair and adjust her dress, just as she had for her first wedding. Aphrodite was apparently in charge of the whole thing, as she usually was with everything. She insisted that her knowledge of hairstyles and fashion was far superior to that of any other woman present, because she was the goddess of love and accustomed to these things. This almost started another war. By the end of it, Athena had retreated in tears, and most of the other goddesses had quit the room. While Athena was the goddess of battle, she was a young goddess, and 1,000 years ago, Aphrodite had once been a goddess of war as well as a goddess of love, and she knew how to be mean. Although Artemis had to agree, she wasn't lying when she said that she knew what hairstyle and manner of dress would be most flattering. Artemis usually dressed very simply in a plain white chiton with gold brooches shoulder-patterned to look like the full moon that was her insignia. While her chiton was still white, the golden belt wrapped around Artemis's waist and chest was tied in a much more elaborate fashion, and Artemis had to admit that it was very flattering. A cape fluttered behind her, held by the golden brooches that held her dress together at the shoulders. It was made out of the very finest kava silk, reaching to the floor and trailing behind her. It was so light it fluttered, even when there was no breeze. Aphrodite's own hair was a riot of black curls barely held back by a double band of ribbon, but she styled Artemis's long blonde hair into smooth curls that cascaded down over one shoulder. Nemesis, Artemis's younger sister, had refused to give way to Aphrodite's temper, and Aphrodite had reluctantly accepted the girl's assistance. She helped Aphrodite with her sister's hair. Her own hair was dark and straight, falling in a sleek waterfall to her waist. Would you like me to do your hair like this when you get married, Nemesis? Aphrodite asked. Oh no, Nemesis exclaimed. When I get married, I shall dress in mourning black. I shall wear no bracelets. They will have to tie my hands with rope, chain my ankles, and gag my mouth when they force me to marry. Aphrodite giggled as she slipped the slender golden wedding bracelets over Artemis's wrists. You change your mind when you get older. Artemis found it difficult to smile. While she had gone willingly to her own wedding with Avarius, if she had known what she was in for, they would have indeed had to tie her hands with rope, chain her ankles, and gag her. I will do everything in my power to make sure that when or if you get married, it will be of your choosing, Artemis assured her. There are pleasures to be had in marriage, but there are no pleasures to be had in marriage to a bad man. You wouldn't know that, Aphrodite. Hephaestus adores you. Aphrodite had the grace to look ashamed. It was a strange dichotomy that the goddess of love, who so adored interfering in the romantic lives of others, had never been unfaithful to her crippled husband. It was common knowledge that Hephaestus truly did adore his beautiful wife, and she worshipped him in return. Aphrodite leaned closer to Artemis, her face suddenly serious. Hephaestus is a god, sister. Whatever damage was done to his body during the accident, he is still a god. You know that I was never in favor of your first husband, but this one is even worse. He's a nobody, one human after another. I just don't understand. My first husband wasn't human, Artemis retorted. He was a monster. Regan is human. Human in the best possible way. A humane, caring, compassionate man. She hesitated before speaking such sacred words. I love him. Aphrodite nodded, then smiled smugly. That's my specialty, sister. Chapter 2. When Artemis and Regan had been joined together by the fates in their kingdom below the mountain, there had been no pomp and circumstance. Lachesis had simply announced it and then gotten on with the meal. This time, there was no avoiding it. Artemis was the daughter of the greatest of the gods, and her wedding had to be suitably ostentatious. This time, all the gods would be there except for Hades and the Fates. That was only because the Fates were confined beneath their mountain, and an ancient interdiction kept Hades from entering Earth's atmosphere. Artemis had tried asking why Hades wasn't allowed on Earth, but her father had grown stony-faced and refused to answer. Both her uncle and the Fates had sent congratulatory messages, but Artemis still wished they could be there. The core of the ceremony was simple. Regan and Artemis stood before her father, clasped hands, and he wound a white ribbon around their wrists. Each of them placed a crown of flowers on the other's head and drank from the same chalice a sip of the wedding wine. Artemis savored the flavor of mingled apples, almonds, and roses, all the fruits of love. Despite all the pomp and ceremony, it was clear that bride and groom only had eyes for each other. Regan was waiting for Artemis when the ceremony started, and when he turned to look at her, their eyes locked and he couldn't seem to look away. He looked stunned, awed, humbled, and when she drew near, Artemis saw the glimmer of an emotional tear in his eye. Though the ceremony stated that she was to remain silent, she whispered, "I love you," and the tear slipped from his eye. Artemis reached up on tiptoe and kissed it from his cheek. Of course, there had to be speeches, and music, and demonstrations of the gods' power as each of them paraded before her, showing off. Aphrodite's idea of showing off nearly resulted in the conception of a child before Zeus intervened. Afterwards, there was a grand banquet. Regan had participated in the banquets held in the house of Zeus every night, so he knew how to behave, but he was thoroughly distracted tonight. He served Artemis from his own plate, but barely swallowed a morsel. During the speeches and demonstrations, she noticed that his eyes were constantly coming back to her. Sarah was a great hit at the wedding and the feast afterwards. She walked down the aisle strewing flowers, looked so happy in her little green dress that Artemis thought her heart would burst. She clambered onto her grandfather's lap and he bade her to hold out her hands. He dropped 3 golden orbs of light into her little palm. 3 gifts, he rumbled, as is fitting for the granddaughter of Zeus. What did you give her? Artemis asked, but the words were barely out before the girl teleported across the room and back, giggling madly. The gods' powers usually manifested at puberty, but it looked like Zeus had given Sarah a head start. It was only when the little girl called down lightning in the banquet hall, light sparkling on the sharp tips of the ceremonial weapons that lined one wall, that Euryclea came forward, stating that it was time little girls were in bed. At last, the banquet drew to a close, and the last guest popped the last candied amoele between their lips. Zeus turned to face the newlyweds. He smiled benevolently. The wedding feast is over, daughter. The time has come for you and your husband to begin your married life together. Artemis blushed, knowing they'd already begun, but her father was already gesturing to the servants. Her eyes went wide when they pushed a bed into the room. It was a 4-poster with gauzy white curtains tied to the posts, but the implication made her mind spin. A bed. A bed. So she could consummate her marriage. Her wide eyes met Regan's. Zeus spoke before either of them could. His voice was usually loud and booming, and he loved to make himself heard, but this time he spoke quietly, just for his daughter. Another ancient tradition for unequal marriages. It should have been used the last time. The last time you married, your husband did not treat you properly. Your marriage will be consummated here before all the gods, so we know that this human is treating you as you deserve to be treated. Father, please, Regan is nothing like Avarius. He treats me so gently. You've seen... I have spoken. Zeus raised his voice a little, and thunder rolled faintly in the distance. The women of the family all got up from their dining couches. They sang a song as they escorted Artemis from the table to the bed. The men gathered around the ambrosia on the other side of the vast room as musicians began to play. The song was sweet, but the beat was slow, drugging, and vaguely erotic. The women drew the curtains of the bed so that they fell in gauzy white sheaths around the bed. They were thick enough that no one would be able to make out details, but they would certainly see shapes. Artemis started to really get nervous. "There's nothing to be worried about," Aphrodite assured her. "You told me how much you love him, how much he loves you. We're not here to judge your technique. We just need to make sure that he isn't hurting you." Artemis kept telling herself that, but by the time the women had removed her cape, loosened her hair, and untied the golden belt around her waist and chest, she was trembling. Still wearing the sheath of kava silk pinned at her shoulders, she lay in the middle of the bed, hands twisting together anxiously at her waist. The women left her there, then returned to the table to bring Regan to his new bride. The song they sang was beautiful and ancient, but Artemis barely heard a word of it. They brought him to sit on the edge of the bed and closed the curtains behind him. The song dissolved into a rain of giggles as they withdrew. The musicians were still playing, and Artemis was terribly glad she couldn't hear more than the faintest echo of the women's chatter as they retreated to the ambrosia. Regan reached out to place his hand on hers. "What's the matter, sweetheart?" he asked. "You know I'd never hurt you." "It's just the last time I was married, Avarius hurt me so badly." Regan's face twisted. "God, sweetheart, you don't know how much I wish I'd wrung his neck back in Knossos. I wish I could kill him for what he did to you. But, sweetheart, you know I'll be gentle, don't you?" "I know." She giggled nervously. "My father would incinerate you if you weren't." Regan lay down beside her and drew her to his heart. He stroked the kava silk of her chiton. "This silk is so soft," Regan whispered. "But there's nothing softer than your skin, sweetheart. Let me touch your skin, Artemis." Artemis pulled her arms reluctantly from his neck and reached for the brooches. She unpinned them one-handed with the ease of long practice and caught the kava silk before it could fall down. Shyly, she handed the brooches to Regan. He went still as she deposited the brooches in his big palm. He looked back up at her. "The night we met," he said hoarsely, "I took the brooches from your dress and crushed them in case they contained trackers. I know that frightened you, baby, and I'm so sorry." Artemis thought back to that first night. He'd given her pleasure within an hour of abducting her. She hadn't understood what was happening to her. Now she couldn't wait for it to happen again. "Do you remember what else you did that night?" she asked shyly. His eyes flared again. "I remember every single minute." Feeling very bold, Artemis let her chiton fall. "You examined me all over to make sure I didn't have any trackers on my body," she reminded him. "Maybe you should check again, just to make sure." By the time they were lying together, trying to recover their breathing after the intense exertion, he'd examined every part of her, and every part of her belonged to him. Artemis had closed her eyes in exhaustion, but when she opened them, Regan was still watching her, his eyes slumbrous as his hand stroked the line of her spine. Despite everything they had just shared, she felt like she'd blush if her cheeks weren't already completely flushed. "Why do you keep looking at me like that?" she asked nervously. He kissed her gently. "I can't believe you went through with it. I was so sure that you were going to change your mind." He watched her seriously. "I don't deserve you, but I will love you all my life." Artemis buried her face against his chest. "I'm yours, Regan. You're the best man I've ever known. I'll always be yours. Just love me. That's all I ask." He stroked the tangled hair back from her face and made her feel like the most cherished woman in the universe. Regan was back in his tunic, and Artemis was fastening the kava silk chiton at her shoulders when they heard the first shout over the low, pulsing music that still played. Regan went still. "That's a man dying," he told her roughly. He'd been a gladiator, Artemis remembered. He knew what a man sounded like when he was dying. He swung his legs over the edge of the bed and sprinted to the other side of the room where the ceremonial weapons were displayed. He took down a sword and tested the weight of it. He wasn't the only one in the room to react. The musicians stopped playing immediately. The gods roused themselves from the slumber they'd fallen into on the relaxation couches after their glut of ambrosia. Artemis hurried to join her sisters, but not to hide, so they could fight together. She had powers to defend herself, as did all the others. Even teenage Nemesis, hair still slightly mussed from her nap, was standing ready, her powers new and ready to incinerate any intruder. Aphrodite looked annoyed that she'd been woken from her slumber, and no one annoyed Aphrodite twice. The sounds of fighting were audible now from the hallway outside the banquet hall. Regan returned to Artemis's side, standing in front of her, shielding her with his body. The next moment, the grand double doors to the ballroom burst open. For a moment, a sound made weak with terror slipped from Artemis's throat. The attackers wore familiar black and gold uniforms, and Iverius was leading them. Chapter 3. He was already covered in blood, a savage grin on his face. He was looking for her, and his eyes narrowed when he found her. He took a step towards her, and the gods showed their powers. Artemis crowded close to Regan, not to be protected, but to protect him. The sheer volume of power released in that room was enough to kill any human. She shielded him as much as she could, even as her own invisible wolves sang their way through the attacking warriors. It was grisly and disgusting. The men died in moments, from the bite of Artemis's wolves, from Zeus's lightning, from Nemesis's fire, and more. At the end of it, a wave rose from nowhere, Aphrodite's doing, and swept the room clean of the invaders as if they had never been there. Nothing remained except for the smell of burnt flesh, except Iverius, still standing in the center of the banquet hall, a naked sword in his hand. Artemis pressed closer to Regan, one of her hands twining with his from behind. Iverius threw his head back and faced Zeus squarely as the father of the gods strode towards him. "How dare you invade my banquet hall?" Zeus boomed. "I have merely come to take back what is my own," Iverius stated. He didn't even take a step back as Zeus approached. "She is not your mate anymore," Aphrodite snapped. "You gave her up when you tortured her. She is not your own. She was never yours. You are human. You have no right to be here." Iverius raised his eyebrows. "If humans are not allowed here, then what is that slave doing in front of my wife?" "He's my husband," Artemis cried, "and a better man than you ever were." "Well then, that's easy enough to prove, isn't it?" Iverius drawled. He reached out a hand towards Regan, even though they were half the length of the banquet hall apart. Regan gave a sudden groan and dropped the sword he was holding. His hands went to his head to clutch desperately at his hair as he moaned in pain. He dropped to his knees and vanished. "What have you done?" Artemis looked around the room as though she might find Regan teleported into a distant corner, but she couldn't see him anywhere. "How did you do that? I thought all your powers came from technology. You're only a human. How do you think I got into Atlantis in the first place?" Iverius asked. "You know that only the gods can enter here." He shrugged. "I have little interest in debating this with you. I nearly came to retrieve what is owed to me." "I will never return to you. I will die first." Iverius laughed. "Do you think I would go to all this trouble to retrieve you? No. You were useful, Artemis. You are no longer useful for me. I have grown beyond anything you can offer me. I'm here to see your father on a matter of business." "You lost your position as steward of the earth when you betrayed my trust," Zeus informed him coolly. "You and I no longer have any business to discuss." "Oh, you're wrong about that," Iverius snarled, taking quick steps towards the father of the gods. "You owe me for my lost wages, and I'm going to take what I am owed." Iverius reached out towards Zeus as he had reached out towards Regan. Nothing visible had passed between them when he reached to Regan, but when he reached for Zeus, a stream of golden light swirled from the father of the gods into the human's palm. Zeus gave a ragged cry as Iverius threw his head back in triumph. It only lasted a moment, but when it was done, Zeus fell to his knees and Avarius disappeared. The whole family rushed towards Zeus. His brother Poseidon caught him as he fell. "Gone," Zeus croaked. "All gone." Then he passed out in his brother's arms. "By Olympus," Poseidon murmured, "the human took his powers." The gods gasped. While it was possible for the gods to gift one another their powers, whether permanently or temporarily, it should have been impossible for anyone to take their powers without consent. Poseidon stood, holding his brother's massive body in his arms. "We must get him into cryo-sleep immediately," he told them. "It is the only way to regenerate his powers." Artemis had never seen the chamber that Poseidon led them to. She had heard the stories, of course, of her Titan ancestors who had entered cryosleep in order to protect their children from a peril beyond the stars that even her father refused to name. But she had never been allowed to enter the chamber of Morpheus where they slumbered. This time she didn't even care. While all the other gods proceeded to the chamber, Artemis sped straight back to her suite to look for her daughter. She burst through the doors, starting Euryclea, who was closing the door to the little girl's bedroom gently. "Where is she?" Artemis demanded, striding into the room. "Why, I just put her down to sleep," Euryclea protested as Artemis pushed past her and opened the door. When she saw that Sarah was safe in her bed, her bright little head resting on the pillow, a wave of relief so intense rushed through Artemis that her knees buckled. She wanted with all her heart to run towards that little girl and sweep her up into her arms. But she knew that if she did, Sarah would only cry. And worse, she would cry for her papa. And papa wasn't there anymore. Artemis began to weep, covering her face with one hand, the other hand still clinging to the doorknob. Euryclea hurried over to her. She had been Artemis's nurse when she herself was a baby and had rested in that very crib. She put her arms around Artemis, and Artemis sobbed into her old nurse's waist. It didn't take long for Artemis to tell the story. It all happened so quickly, and no one knew how it had happened, but all she knew was that Regan was gone. Euryclea acted quickly. She scooped up Sarah from her crib and cuddled the child into her shoulder. "Come, my lady," Euryclea urged. "We will go together and join the gods in the chamber of Morpheus." By the time the three of them arrived in the chamber of Morpheus, Zeus was already in the cryo-sleep pod, and Poseidon was activating the shield that would cover his inert body. Some of the gods were whispering amongst themselves, trying to figure out how the human had managed to breach the defenses of Atlantis and take the powers of the greatest of the gods. No one knew. No one understood how it happened. Unable to bear the terrible tension, Artemis asked Aphrodite to take Euryclea and Sarah under her protection. She had to get answers now. Half an hour later, her shuttlecraft was landing in a spaceship. She climbed out, refusing the assistance of the pilot to alight from the shuttle and holding back tears, even as her uncle hurried to meet her. "Artemis, I am so glad you're here," Hades cried. "What has happened? I have received wild messages from my brother Poseidon that Avarius took Zeus's powers. Such a thing cannot be." He looked around. "Where is Regan? Why is he not with you?" Artemis dissolved into tears again. Hades took hold of her arms gently. "This is not the time for tears, niece. You must tell me all that you know." Artemis threw herself against his broad chest. "Oh, uncle, I wish so much that you had been there." He patted her back gently. "You know I am forbidden to enter Earth's atmosphere. Nothing but that ancient interdiction could have stopped me from celebrating your wedding. Now, dry your eyes and tell me everything, and we shall get to the bottom of this." Artemis dried her eyes obediently and told him the whole story as she walked with him. She didn't even realize where they were going until they entered his private chambers. She hesitated at the doorway. She had never been inside his private rooms before. "You may enter, Artemis," Hades bade her. "You must, if we are to find out what happened to your husband." She caught her breath at the small courtesy of her uncle referring to Regan as her husband. There was a small foyer with several doors leading off it. Hades pressed his palm to one of them. It shimmered with shadows briefly. then slid open. "Uncle?" she said uncertainly as she followed him into a small, dark room. "You are Lord of the Underworld. Can you tell me if he's dead?" Hades shook his head at once. "He is not dead. I would have known that at once." His eyes flared. "More's the pity." Artemis gasped. She'd thought that Hades liked Regan. Hades clarified. "If he were dead, I would have brought him back for you as a wedding gift. He is in the human realm. I cannot enter there, but at this distance I do have the advantage of perspective." He pushed a button and a screen at one end of the room slid aside, showing a large, circular aperture that looked like a window. Only so far out in space, such a thing could not be. It had to be a viewer of some kind, showing the distant Earth and the moon that circled it. Hades stood behind the single chair in the center of the room and placed his hands on it. "You must sit here, niece." She sat. She felt tiny in the huge chair, built for his massive frame, sinking into the soft black leather. "You will find a silver circlet by your left hand. Place it on your head." Like the chair, it was too big for her, but once she had it over her brow, it shrunk to fit. She cried out in sudden fear that it would crush her head, her hands scrabbling at the silver, but it only shrank until it was comfortably seated. "Now," urged his deep voice suddenly gentle, "this part will be no hardship for you. Think of your husband. This is the eye of the underworld. With it, you can see anyone on Earth, anywhere." Tears sprang to her eyes, and at once she thought of Regan as he had been so recently, enclosed in the circle of her arms, encased by her body as they consummated their marriage and exchanged words of love. The eye zoomed in rapidly. Artemis gripped the arms of the chair as the Earth loomed suddenly large in front of her. She recognized first a continent, then a mountain range. Then she knew where it was going to end. She already knew where Regan was by the time the eye had focused on a familiar palace, then down to the dungeons she had never seen, but knew existed beneath it. She heard Hades growl when they saw a familiar face. Regan was unconscious, but his chest was still moving. Alive. By Olympus. He was alive. All her uncle's assurances had meant nothing until Artemis saw it with her own eyes. She wiped away a tear without being conscious of shedding it. He was in a cell far beneath Avarius's palace. The bars of his cell were being locked by a large guard dressed in Avarius's black and gold, and Avarius himself was wiping sweat from his brow. "That's all we can do for now," Avarius said. "Make sure he's ready for the games tomorrow. I've got guests coming." He and the guard both turned to leave the cell. "All right," she said. "So, we go and get him now." She took the circlet from her brow and put it back on the armrest, then stood up to face her uncle. Hades was gripping the back of the chair so hard Artemis heard the metal creak. "I cannot go down there with you," he ground out through gritted teeth. "This damn interdiction keeps me out of Earth's atmosphere. But you must take my guards, all of them. And return to Atlantis first of all, and take the others with you." Artemis thought back to the shock and horror on the gods' faces when they'd realized that Avarius had taken Zeus's powers. He was the most powerful of all of them, and if Zeus was vulnerable, they were all vulnerable. Hades must have seen the doubt in her face. "If they refuse to help you, tell them that I will destroy every last one of them if they do not. I will not allow this man to continue to threaten my family. Do you hear me? I will not allow it." Artemis took a step back, and Hades struggled to control himself. He was one of the eldest gods, equal in power only to his brother Zeus. Even though she knew he loved her, she'd spent 4 years married to a man whose anger was a danger to her, and she couldn't help but quail before a man who raised his voice, even if it was in her defense. She went back to Atlantis. Hades sent several of his guards with her in the shuttle, as many as would fit, and the rest of his forces were to come later, preparing for a full-scale assault on Avarius's stronghold. They were re-entering Earth's atmosphere when Sarah suddenly teleported into her mother's lap. Artemis yelped and grabbed at the little girl. Re-entry was the most dangerous part of any landing, and Sarah wasn't strapped in. "Where's Papa?" she asked. "Yura woke me up, and I want him to put me back to bed." Artemis flinched. She'd known she'd have to face this sooner or later. Papa is busy right now. He'll be back soon to put you to bed, baby. I promise." Sarah pulled out of Artemis's arms, straining against the force of re-entry. "I want Papa!" she screamed, and not only Artemis but every guard in the shuttle winced at her shrill tone. The next thing Artemis knew, Sarah was gone again, teleporting away. She could only hope that she'd gone back to Eurycleia in Atlantis. When she got back to Atlantis, she was astonished to find it nearly deserted. Every member of her family had left except for Aphrodite and Poseidon. She found them in the chamber of Morpheus, speaking quietly over the body of the unconscious Zeus. Eurycleia was drowsing on a chair in the corner, Sarah asleep in her arms as if she'd been asleep all along. "Any news?" Artemis asked. Aphrodite and Poseidon looked up, wide-eyed and a little furtive. "No changes," Poseidon answered. He looked back down to the cryo-sleep pod. "My brother's powers are immense. It will take 1,000 years or more for him to recover." 1,000 years? Artemis gasped. It seemed impossible that Avarius could cause so much damage in so little time. "We figured out how Avarius got into Atlantis in the first place," Aphrodite said. "Without any Alteran blood, he shouldn't have been able to enter Atlantis." Her lips compressed. "We have just discovered that our sister Iris is missing. We believe that he may have taken her powers first. We don't yet know if she lives." Artemis hardly knew Iris. The flighty goddess was always traveling somewhere. How long had she been missing before she'd been missed? "How could Avarius take anyone's powers?" Artemis asked. "He is human. Only human, I know that for sure." "That we cannot say." Aphrodite shook her head. "He is a risk to any of us, sister, before you start thinking of us going down there." "He has my husband. We have to rescue him, Aphrodite." Aphrodite shrugged, and Artemis stared at her in disbelief. She knew that Aphrodite was self-centered and narcissistic, but Artemis never dreamed that she would refuse to help. "Poseidon," Artemis pleaded. "He took your own brother's powers. Are you going to let him get away with that?" "We're not doing nothing," Poseidon retorted. "We are taking action, niece, but we must not be hasty. This human has already taken us by surprise once. It must not happen again. We must be swift and sure when we strike." Artemis's mouth fell open. "I cannot believe that the gods are cowards," she said eventually. "Afraid of a human. How very pathetic." She raised her voice. "Eurycleia, come with me and bring Sarah." "Want Papa?" Sarah murmured as Eurycleia maneuvered herself upright, but the little girl fell straight back asleep. "We'll return to our rooms," Artemis said. When the door of the chamber closed behind them, she started walking Eurycleia quickly down the hallway. "If I do not return, Eurycleia, I want you to take Sarah to my uncle Hades. He will look after both of you. I will make sure that his guards are ready to accompany you to his house." "My lady, where are you going?" Eurycleia whispered, looking over her shoulder in case Aphrodite or Poseidon came out of the chamber behind them. "I'm going to get my husband back." Chapter 4. It was all well and good to say bold words, Artemis thought, as she landed her shuttlecraft in the mountains beyond Avarius's palace as dawn began to lighten the sky. It was another thing to do bold deeds. She knew more about Avarius's palace than he realized. She'd learned every possible way out of it in case she could escape one day. She never thought she'd be using that knowledge to return. She entered the palace through a tunnel that Avarius himself had built so that he could smuggle goods and people in and out without notifying her father. She had traded her traditional white kava silk chiton for a pair of dark leather trousers with high boots and a close-fitting tunic. Her hair was scraped back into a braid to keep it out of her eyes. This passage was usually unguarded because it was securely locked, but she needed to be ready in case she was detected. The door between the tunnel and the dungeons was locked, as she knew it would be, but she didn't need a key. The humans knew her as the goddess of the hunt because she'd spent so much of her youth running through the forests of Earth with wild beasts as her companions. Usually when she exercised her powers, she called invisible wolves to her aid, but they weren't the only animals to come to her call. This time she called the spiders. They came as invisible and swift as her wolves and entered the lock. Their long, capable legs pressed the tumblers and the lock clicked open. Artemis sent them a silent thank you as they retreated to the netherworld she'd called them from. She was just reaching out for the door handle when she heard a small voice from below. "Where's Papa? I want Papa." Artemis froze, her eyes flying wide in the darkness. She looked down. Sarah was small and sleepy by her side, but determined. Artemis crouched beside her. "Baby, no, you can't be here. You have to go back to Euryclea." "Don't want Eura, I want Papa." Sarah's voice began to rise. Desperate to keep the child quiet, Artemis put her arms around her, but this just made Sarah louder. "I want Papa! I want Papa!" Sarah flailed at Artemis, beating at her head and shoulders with her tiny hands. All Artemis's attempts to comfort her were in vain. The door opened. Artemis looked up. "Here I am, daughter." Artemis went cold. Avarius was there. Artemis wasn't even sure if Sarah recognized Avarius. He'd had her sent to the House of Women to be raised by his concubines. She was pretty sure she'd only ever seen Avarius from a distance on ceremonial occasions. Avarius wasn't alone. His captain was with him, Baelor, the man who had insisted that Sarah be promised to him as his bride. Handsome as a statue, Baelor was just as cold and hard. Artemis had thought that no one could be worse than Avarius, but it had taken all Avarius's powers of persuasion to convince Baelor to allow Sarah to come of age first. Sarah went quiet instantly, staring up at the men standing over her and her mother. Then she vanished, leaving Artemis alone with her ex-husband and his captain. "No!" Baelor shouted. "She's mine! Bring her back!" He lunged towards Artemis, but Avarius held him back with one arm. "We have more important things to address than a recalcitrant child. I should have known the brat would inherit some of her grandfather's powers. Come with me, Artemis." He bent to grasp her arm and raised her to her feet. His hand was tight enough to bruise. "I recommend that you do not resist." Artemis tried to jerk her arm away. "I'm not your property, Avarius, and I'm not going to take your recommendations." She reached out to the animals who ran with her through the woods again, and this time called the bear. She had never used her powers on Avarius before. In hindsight, she thought grimly, that was a terrible shame, and ought to be rectified. This time she called the bear. She heard it growl and felt its presence, its heavy warmth as it went past her. Many a night she'd spent as a girl, curled up in the warmth of the bear's invisible embrace. Now Avarius and Baelor were going to die in that embrace. The bear went for Baelor first. It slashed at his face and deep wounds opened up in his cheeks. Baelor screamed and raised his arms. Deep gouges appeared through sudden rents in his uniform and another across his belly. Avarius raised his hand and the growling of the bear disappeared. Artemis reached for its spirit, but it was out of her reach. Avarius was holding it away from her. She called for her other animal helpers, but all of them were just out of reach. Baelor collapsed, screaming and bleeding, hands moving from his belly to his face as if he wasn't sure if the massive hole in his gut was worse than the slashes on his pretty face. Avarius stepped over him. "He'll recover, or he'll die," he said casually to Artemis, as though Baelor hadn't been by his side for a decade. He used his grip on her arm to push her forward. "This way." Artemis skirted her way around the screaming, writhing Baelor, and, heart in her throat, went with her ex-husband. Her mind was racing forward to all the terrible things that might happen. By Olympus, to go back to that room, to that prison, to know that he could open the door at any moment and demand anything. To come back from dinner and see the jar of lubricant on the nightstand, because he preferred to use it, not out of any consideration of her, was intolerable. To know that she might earn a punishment for any infraction. She felt like she was going to be sick. She could barely see where they were going. All she could think of was the room he'd kept her in when they were married. She could hardly breathe. She was confused when he took her to a cell, but her mind was full of remembered horrors. She wrapped her arms around her body protectively. "Please don't touch me," she begged. "Please, Avarius, please, anything but that." His lip curled in a sneer, but she didn't care. Anything but that look of cruel intention he'd always worn when he visited her room. "Save it," he snarled. "I'm not interested. You never were that good in bed, anyway." He closed the cell door between them and locked it. It was barely more than a hole carved out of the rock. "What are you going to do to me, then?" Artemis asked. Her arms were tight around her waist, and she couldn't unclamp them for anything. "Your position as daughter of Zeus has no value beyond entertainment now. I have his powers. I rule the earth." He smiled thinly. "All the gods are terrified of me now. I saw it in their faces. They won't challenge me in case I take their powers too. The age of gods is over. The age of humans has begun." Artemis shivered. He was glad, proud, and smug. "What are you going to do to me?" she repeated. He looked thoughtful. "I have some friends coming tomorrow. It might amuse them to see you executed. I'll have to think about what will be most interesting." Artemis fell back until only the wall held her up. He'd been vicious and cruel to her before, but he'd never spoken so casually about killing her. He meant it too. He wasn't boasting. He was just stating a fact. He didn't say goodbye when he left, just walked out of the room as if she meant nothing, which she knew was the absolute truth. There was a stone bench along one side of the cell, and Artemis sank down onto it, then jumped up again. She'd lain on a bed of stone once before, in the house of women where Avarius had sent her to be a concubine to his guards. She couldn't sit there now. She dropped to the floor, sitting with her back to the wall, her knees drawn up to her chin, holding them with her arms. What was she going to do now? Not only had she failed to find and rescue Regan, but she was going to be executed tomorrow. Sarah would lose both mother and father in one day. Artemis's head fell back to rest against the wall. Euryclea would take Sarah to Hades, and he would care for her, as he'd cared for Artemis when she was a little girl. Maybe when Sarah grew up, she wouldn't remember either of them. She loved Regan, but she'd only known him for a few weeks. She still hardly knew her mother. Artemis closed her eyes. It had all been for nothing. All of it. All of it. Except for the fact that Sarah had been rescued from the House of Women. She wouldn't be given to Baelor when she came of age. She would grow up safe and loved. Artemis put her head into her arms and cried. When she felt a hand touch her arm, she screamed and jerked away. Sarah was right beside her, her little arm still outstretched. Artemis tried to compose herself so she didn't frighten the little girl any further. "Don't cry," Sarah urged. She took a step closer to Artemis, regaining the space she'd had before Artemis jerked away from her. She put her hand on Artemis's cheek this time, wiping away a tear. "Don't cry, Mama." It took every ounce of willpower Artemis ever had not to burst into tears again. It was the first time Sarah had ever willingly called her Mama. And by Olympus, it was nearly worth it to hear the sweet word in her baby's voice. "Darling," Artemis croaked and cleared her throat. "I'm all right, darling. Really, I am. What are you doing here? You should be with Euryclea." "Eura woke me up this morning and I didn't like it. You always wake me up. Papa puts me to sleep and Mama wakes me up." Artemis felt like her heart was about to burst. Sarah had never asked for her like this before. "Oh, darling. Oh, my special girl." Cautiously, terrified of rejection, she opened her arms. Sarah went right into them and snuggled into her lap. A joy so intense it was almost painful swelled Artemis's heart. She would have given anything to spend the rest of her life in this moment, but she knew it had to end. She didn't know how long it would be before Avarius returned. After what was both the longest and shortest moment of her life, Artemis pulled away from her baby girl. "Darling, can you be a good girl for me?" "Yes, Mama." In the darkness of the cell, Artemis was so happy it hurt. She stroked the baby's soft red curls away from the round face. "Can you go back to Euryclea and tell her to take you on a holiday?" Sarah's green eyes went wide. "A holiday?" Artemis realized that Sarah had never had a holiday in her life. She'd been a prisoner in the House of Women from the day she'd been weaned. Ignoring the hurt in her heart and reminding herself that Sarah would know what it was like to take a holiday when she was living with Hades, she smiled. "Tell her that you're allowed to visit your Uncle Hades. If she objects, tell her Mama said so." "A holiday," Sarah repeated. She threw her arms around her mother. "Thank you, Mama." Gently, feeling like she was tearing away a part of her soul, Artemis detached the clinging arms. "Go back to Euryclea now, darling. Be my good girl." She bit back the tremble in her lip. "I love you, darling. I love you so much. Love you forever, my special girl." Sarah suddenly turned shy, but she didn't withdraw. "Bye, Mama," she said and vanished. And then the cell was the darkest place on earth. Artemis put her head back in her hands and wept. She didn't have long to wait. It was only a few hours before guards arrived at the door of her cell. She rose from the floor to greet them. She'd tried to reach her animal companions and found them still out of reach. Avarius had done something to inhibit them, she realized, but he hadn't bothered to take her powers as he had her father's. She supposed that he didn't consider her powers worthwhile. Not that it would matter in a few minutes. She didn't fight the guards. There were 6 of them sent to escort her, each of them easily twice her size, fully armored and armed. She didn't have a chance of getting away. Because she went with them obediently, they didn't have to force her along. One of them held her arm, but lightly, in sharp contrast to the way Avarius had bruised her when he held her arm. This man was probably going to kill her, and even he didn't hate her as much as her ex-husband. She was led from the darkness of the cells, lit only by distantly spaced flaming torches, to brilliant daylight. It dazzled her. She winced and shielded her eyes, shying away from the stinging light. The guard held her arm more firmly. A sudden swell of noise assaulted her ears. It sounded like the sea, like the howling of winds in a violent storm, like the crash of rocks and trees in a landslide. But it wasn't. It was people, cheering, a crowd. Through squinted eyes, she looked around and realized that she was in an arena. When she'd been the wife of Avarius, she'd occasionally had to attend the gladiatorial games, but she hadn't realized that this was what he meant when he'd said he was having friends to visit. Avarius did have friends, people as mean and cruel as he was himself, who wanted what they could get from proximity to his power. But this was what he really craved: adulation, the worship of the crowd. He hungered for their approbation. Artemis was starting to feel real fear now. He'd said that he needed to think how he could make her death the most entertaining. If she was in an arena, then he was going to make her death a spectacle. She couldn't hope for a quick, merciful execution. This was really going to hurt. The crowd fell silent, and Avarius began to speak. "My people, honored guests, we have a special treat for you today." They cheered again, and Avarius lapped it up. Artemis's eyes still hadn't adjusted to the brilliant light, but she knew exactly how his face would look in this moment. So smug. Unbearably smug. It was almost worth it to die to know that she'd never see that look again. "Today I bring before you one that you have previously seen beside me, arrayed in the finest of silks, adorned as befits a goddess. Behold today, in the sands of the arena, my own wife, Artemis, the daughter of Zeus." The crowd gasped. They didn't cheer. They probably didn't know how he wanted them to react. It was never a good idea to react the wrong way to Avarius. Artemis had learned that the hard way. So had many others who would never be seen again. There was a heavy, metallic noise, a grating sound, then a thud. Artemis shivered, even though she was still surrounded by the guards, so it probably wasn't going to happen yet. That was the sound of a door opening onto the arena. Something or someone would come from there that would be the end of her. Artemis squinted around but couldn't see which door had opened. Her eyes still stung from the sudden transition to the light. She didn't hear any growling or barking, so maybe it wasn't an animal. She didn't hear the clang of armor or the thud of many boots, so it wasn't a large group of men. Some silent animal, like a slinking lioness, perhaps, swift and brutal, or a single man, who may not be swift, but would definitely be brutal. Avarius spoke again. I know that many of you aren't aware of the, changes that have occurred in my house in the last few weeks. My wife has lost her privileged status and been replaced by a selection of dedicated ladies of the House of Women. And the reason for this change you see before you. Behold, the slave my wife took to her bed. The crowd was silent. Artemis drew in a sharp breath. Regan? Regan was here. By Olympus. Was he chained? Why hadn't he cried out to her? Where was he? Was he alive? Was he intact? When Avarius went on, there was humor in his voice. But I believe this slave has had a change of heart. He and I had a long talk last night, and I can be most persuasive. This time he doesn't just want her in his bed. He chuckled. I think you'll find this most entertaining. Let the games begin. He struck the gong that meant the start of combat. The guards that had surrounded Artemis dispersed. She turned, looking around the arena, and saw Regan approaching her. She felt like she hadn't dared breathe until she saw he was all right. He didn't appear to be injured. He was walking with the same easy, athletic grace as ever. His dark eyes were trained on her. Artemis opened her mouth to cry out to him, but then she realized that his pace was deliberate. His gaze was impersonal. He didn't even seem to recognize her. And there was an axe in his hand. Chapter 5. Artemis backed away from him, slowly at first, then faster. She found her voice. Regan? Regan, what are you doing? Regan? She heard a titter from the crowd and someone whispered, Whore. She ignored them and kept her eyes on the man stalking her across the arena. He wasn't running. He was just doing a job. Regan, no! She cried. Regan, it's me, Artemis, your wife. Remember, Regan, I'm your wife. He said nothing, just continued to track her around the arena. There were a number of obstacles placed there to make the games more interesting. Artemis leaped up onto a pile of boulders as Regan raised the axe. She was lighter than him. Maybe she was more agile. But he was more muscular, and all that bulk didn't slow him down. He leaped up onto the rocks after her like a mountain lion. She screamed as he raised the axe and swung it towards her. The crowd laughed. Artemis jumped down from the rocks and sprinted across the arena, her boots digging into the sand-covered floor. The sand made running difficult. Regan's thighs and calves were rippling with corded muscle, whereas Artemis had been starved by her ex-husband until just a few weeks ago, and had yet to regain the muscle she'd lost. He was gaining on her quickly. That look in his eyes. He didn't even recognize her. This wasn't the same man who shook with pleasure in her arms after the wedding ceremony, who had been so careful and tender with her body. This was a warrior, a hunter intent on his prey. This was a gladiator, as he had been for years before he escaped. And he was just a man doing his job. His face was completely blank, as if Avarius had wiped it clean when he was persuading him, and Artemis realized that was precisely what Avarius had done. Regan didn't recognize her. Maybe Avarius had even put something into Regan's head to make him see something other than her in her place. She tripped. She twisted as quickly as she could, but he was right behind her. She sprawled on the ground and reached up to him. Regan, Have mercy, please. I love you, darling, please. He stood over her and raised the axe, looking down at her with those terrible blank eyes, and she was paralyzed with fear. And then, worse. Sarah's voice right beside her. The crowd went wild with delight. Artemis screamed, "No!" and reached for her daughter. She wrapped herself around the child, shielding her with her body. She heard Sarah trying to wriggle free, exclaiming, "Papa!" She waited for the first blow of the axe on her body, praying that she could protect Sarah from its blows. There was a thump. She turned her head slightly and saw the axe on the ground beside her. She looked back at Regan. He was staring at her in horror, his face a pasty shade of gray. "No," he whispered. "Gods, no." The next thing, Artemis knew, her protective arms were empty. Sarah had teleported right out of them and into Regan's arms. He fell to his knees, his nerveless arms hardly able to hold the small child. Sarah was babbling about her holiday. Artemis reached for her. And everything shifted. Suddenly, she found herself in a familiar room. This was the suite they shared in the House of Hades. She was still touching Sarah, as was Regan, and the little girl had teleported them to her uncle's house for their holiday. She was already telling them about the teddy bear Hades had given her that had once been her mother's. Euryclea was there, a fragile old hand pressed to her heart. "Oh, my lady," she cried. "You did it." Artemis looked across at Regan, not entirely sure she had. He'd lost that blank look, but not the look of horror. "Euryclea, please take Sarah," Artemis choked. Regan seemed to realize he was still holding Sarah, and he jerked back suddenly. He didn't say a word as the old nurse came to pick up the child. Now that they were all together in the House of Hades and ready for their family holiday, Sarah didn't seem to notice that her parents couldn't stop staring at each other. She let Euryclea lead her away to show her the delights of her great-uncle's house. Regan and Artemis were alone. Regan twisted to his feet and strode away from her, raising his hands to grip his hair. She stood up, too. She reached out mentally for her animal companions, just in case she needed them, and felt them ready to come to her call. Whatever had kept them out of reach in the house of Avarius no longer bound her. She waited, hoping against hope that Avarius had also lost his grip on her husband. When Regan spun back to face her, there were tears in his eyes. "I swear by all the gods," he groaned. "I didn't know it was you. That man got into my head. All I saw was a monster I had to slay. I thought I was back in the ring. It was gods, Artemis. I wish I'd died before I frightened you." A flood of relief washed over her. Whatever Avarius had put into his head, it was gone now, just as whatever had separated her from her animal companions was gone now. His powers couldn't reach them from this far away. A brief surge of rage followed that Avarius had so nearly done irreparable damage to them both. Artemis walked over to him. He shied away from her, as if he was the one who was frightened. She followed him as implacably as he'd followed her in the ring until he was backed into a corner. He covered his face with his hands, pressing the heel of his hands hard into his eyes as if he couldn't bear to look at her. "Don't, darling," Artemis murmured. "You'll hurt yourself." She pulled his hands away from his eyes and he let her. "I was the monster," he cried hoarsely. "I thought I was hunting a monster, but I was the monster." "No," Artemis said sternly. "Avarius was the monster. Not you, Regan. I love you." She pressed herself against him, resting her cheek against his wildly beating heart. He trembled from head to foot, and his arms stayed by his sides as if he was afraid to touch her. "I nearly killed you," he whispered. "Gods, I would have killed myself right after." "You dropped the axe," she reminded him. "Even with that monster in your head, you couldn't do it." He still didn't embrace her as she was aching for him to do. "It was Sarah," he admitted. "I saw her and she was like a flame in the dark. I knew she didn't belong in that nightmare he put inside me. And I thought, if she's not real, what else about this isn't real?" Artemis slid her arms around his waist. "This is real," she reminded him. "Me holding you is real. Me loving you is real, darling." It had always been special to him when she called him darling. He'd admitted to her that when she first used the sweet name for him, that had been the moment when everything changed for him, when his whole world had suddenly shifted and reoriented itself around her. His arms came up to encircle her shoulders, carefully, tentatively. She felt the enormous strength in those arms, held under rigid control. The tremors still racked his body, but his hands were unspeakably gentle on her body. He'd always been so gentle with her, so tender. A need began to grow inside her to show him how much she loved him. She wanted to open herself for him, give herself to him, let passion exorcise the demons those terrible hours had put into his head. She reached up to kiss him, but for the first time he didn't bend his head for her, and she couldn't reach him. She had to settle for kissing his throat instead, and felt the tremor in his body transition to a shudder. His skin was musky and salty with sweat beneath her lips. His hands began to stroke her back, probably without him even realizing it. He gripped her shoulders and pulled her away. "I told you before the wedding that I didn't deserve you." He swallowed hard. "I will never, ever deserve you." Artemis gazed up at him, letting him see the love and need in her eyes. "Just love me, Regan," she replied, as she had before. "That's all I ask. Just love me." Finally, he bent his head and sought her lips for a kiss. It was as soft and tender as their first kiss had been, in the realm of the fates, his lips tentative and searching against hers. She opened for him, and he deepened the kiss, moaning softly. When their lips parted, Artemis stepped back from him and took his hand. "Come into the bathing room with me, Regan. Let me wash away every trace of what that evil man nearly did to us both. Let me show you how much I love you." With a groan, Regan eagerly followed her. Epilogue. In the shadowy corridors leading to the dungeons under his house, Iverius strode through the dark. He scowled, but didn't hurry or slow his steps. Nothing could be done about it now. Revenge would come in time. He came to Baylor's unconscious body lying sprawled on the ground. He'd lost a lot of blood, but his chest still moved shallowly. Iverius stopped and crouched beside his captain. Cupped in his hand was a tiny, precious morsel. He prized open Baylor's clenched jaw and dropped the ambrosia on his parched tongue. It took a few moments for the ambrosia to take effect. The chest started to move more easily. Color returned to the lean cheeks. The wounds on his cheeks, arms, and belly closed and resolved into scars that looked as if he'd already carried them for years. Baylor opened his eyes and stared up at Iverius. "Master," he gasped. He held his hands out in front of him and examined them in shocked delight as the nails turned black, thick, and pointed. The skin grew ruddy and rough. The change extended along his whole body. His previously handsome face grew monstrous, and 2 horns sprouted from his brow. A moment later, and a devil had taken the place of the man. A broad smile stretched his ugly lips, revealing black, sharp teeth. He laughed, then changed back to his previous shape. "Tell me what you would have me do, Master. I will crush the world for your sake." Iverius stood. Baylor followed suit. "Come," Iverius said. "We must make plans. There is much to be done." I hope you enjoyed Rescuing Regan by Catherine West. The story continues many years in the future with impersonating Aphrodite. Fated mates, forbidden desires, and a perilous masquerade intertwine in a galaxy governed by tyrannical gods. Meggie. When my mother told me I had special powers, I thought I'd use them to do something extraordinary. I didn't think that she'd die. I didn't think I'd use them to pretend to be her so that I could get a boring job so I could earn a living, so I could look after my little sister. But I did. And I'll do anything for her. Anything. Meeting a handsome warrior from beyond the stars and learning that he's my fated mate was a complication I didn't need. But when alien warriors abduct my sister, I'll go to any lengths to save her. After 14 years of impersonating a middle-aged woman, I'm going to impersonate Aphrodite. Brav. I've loved Meggie from the minute I saw her in the mirror of the fates. There was never any question in my mind that I would help her rescue her sister. But I can't let her get too close. I can't let myself get too close. I've got secrets. I'm not fit to be the mate of a goddess. I'll help her. Then I'll let her go. When I have to help her impersonate Aphrodite, though, the lines get blurred. All of a sudden, she needs more from me than just my protection. Impersonating the goddess of love requires her to push every boundary she's ever built. I'll do anything for her, even walk away when it's all over. Prepare to be captivated and thrilled by this steamy science fiction romance series where powerful women and their fated mates traverse a dark and dangerous galaxy together.